Next up, we're going to talk about what we call an IIFE, or you may have heard it called as an IIFE, but it really stands for Immediately Invoked Function Expression. Now, at the beginning of this chapter, I actually told you that doing something like this was invalid syntax, and that is actually correct. However, there is a trick to being able to create an anonymous function, or even we can give it a name if we'd like, and then having it invoke itself at runtime. Now, in the last video, we looked at JavaScript closures. So in this video, we're going to put a small twist on what we learned in the last video. So let's go ahead and we're going to say const carPartID, and then we're going to assign it a function. Now, as we know, this is a function expression, and the title of this video is an immediately invoked function expression. So what does that mean? It means that this function should be called the moment the JavaScript parser hits it, without us having to invoke carPartID by itself. Now, what we're going to do with this, and this has been the base for creating some kind of private scope in JavaScript. Now, JavaScript does not have private scope, but we can somewhat emulate that using an IIFE. And what we're going to do is wrap this in parentheses. Now, what this does is treat the contents of what's inside these parentheses as an expression, which then allows us to essentially, and this may look weird, we can call that function. So in a sense, if we console log out this carPartID, we're not going to see anything yet, but our JavaScript function has just called itself. We're just logging it out. We're not calling it. There's no parentheses. We are just simply running this function as soon as the JavaScript parser hits it. Now we can confirm that, and we can add some text inside of here, and you'll see in the DevTools console, we get that hello world, which is immediately invoked. Now again, just for reference, we are not calling this function because it's not a function. It is completely undefined. There is nothing returned from here. So you may be asking, why do we want to do this? Now, traditionally in JavaScript, before modules came about, we made really great use of this IIFE. And you can think of it as more of a development pattern rather than an everyday use case. So what we ended up with was typically something like our entire JavaScript file was wrapped in one of these IIFEs. And that allowed all of our variables inside to have some nice scoping. So typically it would look something like this. That means that any of our variables, any of our functions aren't available in the global scope, which makes our code much safer to write. Now, an interesting piece, if we go ahead and undo those changes, is that we can in fact pass arguments into this IIFE. Now, much like a typical function, this is how we call it. So you can imagine these parentheses here have just moved from here to the end of the expression because it's a function expression which just calls itself, which means that any arguments that we want to give it go here. So let's go ahead and we'll create some unique hash again that we're going to use in this video. So how do we get access to the variable inside our function? Now, it's pretty simple. All we need to do is add the ID, and we can replace our console log with the ID. And there you have it. So we're essentially calling the function after it has been defined, and we're calling it immediately with an argument which takes the ID as a parameter, and we simply just go ahead and log it out. So let's continue with this and create another the ID. And what we're going to do is car_part, and then we're going to interpolate that ID like we did in the previous lesson. Now, it might be that we do not want this constant, the ID, to be floating around for absolutely anyone to access, which is why we're going to scope it, and we're going to be sensible and say, I don't want anyone to touch this constant, and if we do, in fact, try and access it outside of here, it's going to be completely undefined. So we're not allowed to use it. So it's a safer pattern and a safer way of doing so. Now, the good thing about this, and you see this undefined over here, we can now return a new function, which then takes a name, And again, inside like the previous video where we explored function closures, we can return that ID followed by the name. So we'll save this out. We will see now a different function inside our console. Now you may be thinking at this point, hang on a minute, this return string.concat with another string concat isn't the same code that we've written here. Now because we're using Babel, Babel is in fact compiling the code that we write here into plain ECMAScript version 5 JavaScript, much like we talked about at the beginning of this course when we talked about how Babel works in compilation. So all we're seeing here is what Babel is creating for us. Now we're using something interesting called a source map, which means that when we go ahead and inspect this, you can actually see our raw source code. So if anything does act a bit strange, we can immediately see the file of where it's coming from. And the key part is that it's still in the language that we're writing in. We don't see the compiled Babel version. So with that out of the way, how do we go about calling this function? The same as in the last video where we talked about closures. Because we are returning a function, you can see we have this F here. That stands for function. We can go ahead and say left door. We'll duplicate this. We'll say right door. And just for effect, we'll add the windscreen as well. So you can see here again, this is just a different way, a different pattern of creating almost the same thing as before. But instead of having the option, we're essentially hard coding that initial car part ID. So in this use case, we can absolutely use this car part ID function multiple times. And if we want to change it, we would in fact have to duplicate this entire block. So depending on what you want to do, depending on the use case, it's completely up to you. But now we understand closures and function scope, and now a way to immediately invoke a function at runtime, pass in an initial ID, and this could be something that's perhaps dynamically populated from a server variable that you just only want to read it once, and then we can pass it into the rest of the scope without having to worry about where it is in a particular scope chain. So that's it for this video. That's an immediately invoked function expression. We can also use arrow functions for this. If we wanted to demonstrate this, we can use an ID. Again, this becomes a little bit more difficult to read, but you can see how the ES 2015 string literals and arrow functions help us clean the code up somewhat, and we're left with a nice clean code base.